Hello and welcome to Ingression, the only series that gives you the best tips, tricks, and information on the game that we all love, Ingress. I'm your lovable, enlightened instructor, Incredible Hulk, aka Colin Williams. Now this is the behind-the-scenes video to the best phones to use for Ingress. As of fourth quarter 2017, and we'll possibly use this same method for the first and second quarters of 2018, depending on feedback. Now we're going to break down the way that we made the secret sauce that selected the phones recommended for Ingress, as well as welcome your feedback for how the algorithm can be improved for the future. And now it should be noted there are some things that we'd like to have considered for the phones, but we can't for practical reasons. I would absolutely love to include GPS accuracy as a metric, but that data isn't commonly tested and isn't available. And when looking at 70 plus phones, I can't exactly buy them all for testing. Adding points only for those I have access to wouldn't be fair, so a few preferred categories had to be left out, like that GPS one. Also, we're only looking at phones available for sale in the US, or at least easily purchased in the US with a warranty through somewhere like Amazon. The reason is in case there's a defect or something that happens. We've seen this happen a lot with phones recently where there's a major warranty defect. I want to make sure that you guys are covered. Plus, there is hundreds of phones made every year, so cataloging all phones would be near impossible. Now, phones imported to the US and that work on US cellular bands are usually available for import to many other countries, including Europe, and the US and Europe has most of our viewership. The phones did also have to be released in 2017. Older phones are just less likely to get important security updates, and I don't want to recommend purchasing a phone that is pretty much already obsolete. It may have the same hardware because it's a couple years older as a newer phone. Like a lot of phones have the same hardware as the LG G6, but it might not get an update, and that's very important for the long term of our viewers and their safety. Now, usually if the phone was good, if it was really good, there's probably going to be an updated version available in 2017. Phone companies don't stop making good phones for the most part. Now to start off the algorithm, we looked at the processor speed. Now the recommendations made in the first Ingress recommended phones a couple of years ago turned out to be flawed. Now although the processor recommended should have been the fastest according to the specs available, we had some issues with the Snapdragon 810. Thermal throttling ended up crippling some of the phones, and we saw a huge delta of like up to 20% between the phone's processor speed. That shouldn't have been there. So for the new series, I looked at actual tested synthetic benchmark data. 3D Mark's Ice Storm Unlimited was used for several reasons. Ice Storm Unlimited uses OpenES 2.0. That structure is similar to what is recommended for the minimum Ingress requirements. Ice Storm also draws all the graphics at the exact same 720p resolution. And this is important because when we're comparing phones, it makes sure that the screen resolution doesn't lower one phone's score compared to another, like some benchmarks do, where you'll see a phone with low resolution get a higher score than it should, comparatively. And lastly, 3D Mark has a searchable database that covers most of the phones that we looked at. And it's one of the top benchmarks used by reviewers for new phones that are not yet in the database. So we were able to kind of grab scores from there if it was brand new and there wasn't aggregate data. Now, the scores for 3D Mark were weighted. So the first 15,000 points were considered the most important and given 1 point for every 2,000 points they received on 3D Mark. And that is because we see a huge difference in Ingress performance on lower level devices. So for example, the Nokia 3 scores around 3,700 points. And the Moto G5 Plus scores around 13,800 points. So that's a little over a 10,000 point difference. But if you compare that 13,800 point Moto G5 Plus to the 27,800 point LG G6. And even though there's a bigger point difference, it's 14,000 instead of 10,000, the playing difference between the Nokia 3 and the Moto G5 Plus will be much more noticeable in almost all play times. So really, once you've hit that 15,000 point range, you should be good in most areas that aren't highly dense or if you're not firing off a lot of weapons, because it doesn't have to draw and calculate as much. But we do have some of those areas, so you might still run into a highly dense area. So scores above 15,000 got 1 point for every 5,000 ice storm points between 15,000 to 30,000. So a phone that got 20,000 points on Ice Storm benchmark would get 7.5 points for the first 15,000 and an additional point for that next 5,000 for a total of 8.5. Now, above that 30,000, only 1 point more was awarded, and that is because once you hit that level of phone, we've seen in real world playing, there's very, very few situations where your phone doesn't have enough power to run the Ingress graphics. It's usually something else that's bottlenecking you, like the server or the local cell tower. It's rare that you're going to have an area that is so portal dense that when you fire off a weapon, it's going to choke on that. Now, there were a few phones, I do have to say, that where the exact 3D mark data couldn't be found, usually the lower end phones or the very, very, very brand new phones. And in that instance, the nearest neighbor was used, and we made sure that had the exact same processor and RAM amount. Now, if there was multiple nearest neighbors, the score was averaged between them to be as fair as possible, although that honestly created very little difference. The usual variance in scores between phones with the same processor is less than 10%, and most often it is less than 5%. So the estimated score should be accurate within 0.5 points in our total Ingress phone aggregate score that we use for our own calculations. Now, the next category we looked at was screen resolution. Now, the reason we considered this is because you can see, and we've seen, that the higher the resolution of the phone screen, the more of the map you can see in game. This can be especially useful if you're traveling fast. Now, this also means that you can see more of the map on mobile intel. Same with desktop screens. 4K screens can see more mobile intel and more portals than a full HD screen. But when we polled everyone, it's not as important of a category as graphics power. So phones that were HD or 720p got 1 point. Full HD was 2 points. Quad HD was 3 points. And 4K or above, there was none that were above, got 4 points. And there were some weird resolutions in the middle, like iPhones, which would get partial points in between the closest resolutions. So like the iPhone 10 got 2.5 points, because it was about in between the two resolutions of full HD and quad HD. Now, total RAM was the next thing we considered. The reason RAM was taken into account is because of two reasons, and number one, and most important, if your device is low on RAM space and you switch out of Ingress, it may dump the current app and data from the memory. No doubt you've experienced switching Ingress to another app. Maybe it's the music that you have playing, or it's the Intel map, and switching back to Ingress and having to completely reload the app, which takes lots of time. Even on fast phones, you're losing seconds there. The second reason is that even though current Android and iOS versions have good memory managers, you'll still experience a big hit if there's not enough free memory. Now, most OSs today need phones with at least 1 GB of RAM. And the reason that manufacturers say that is because that their system will use a huge, huge, huge chunk of that 1 GB. Because of that, phones with only 1 GB were awarded only half a point when it comes to RAM. But phones with more than 1 GB were given 3/4 of a point for every gigabyte of RAM they had. But if we're being honest, and anyone in tech can tell you this, past 6 GB of RAM on a phone, you will rarely see any difference as of probably even the apps we see in 2018. And with apps we run, right now especially. So the RAM score was capped at 4 points. So basically no extra points past 5.5 gigs of RAM. So a phone with 8 gigs of RAM had the same score as a phone with 6 gigs of RAM. Now, battery life was marked at a fairly high weighting in the points, according to the survey when we talked to you guys. Now, even though Ingress players often carry large battery banks, having a long-lasting battery to begin with provides several advantages. And first and foremost, if you have a long-lasting battery, you may not need to bring your battery pack with you. If you're only playing for a couple hours, you may not want to haul a huge 20,000 milliamp battery pack with your every step if you're trying to travel nice and light or doing like a long hike. You might want that for a water bottle instead. Also, you might forget to charge your battery packs. Happens to all of us. Or you might forget them at home. So having a long-lasting battery will keep you from having to cut your ingressing short. And lastly, batteries can only be charged so many times before they die and need to be replaced. A lot of Ingress players see this because of how much we charge our batteries. The more charge it holds to begin with, the less times you'll have to charge it. And the longer that battery is probably going to last in the long run. So you don't have to replace it as soon, or especially with the ones that are, most of the phones are now like this unibody sealed where you have to spend like $100 to replace a battery. It's a pain. So having that up front is very useful. Now to get the battery info, we used battery testing data, real world battery testing data from GSM Arena's real life battery tests. We set the sliders to simulate 4 hours of video playback and 4 hours of web browsing and 3.5 hours of calling. So that's a close approximation of what having Ingress in apps like Slack or Spotify running in the background will do as far as the percentages of data and antenna versus CPU, GPU use, especially with like things like hardware acceleration on video playback. But also those aren't as intensive as Ingress, because like you turn up with these results where it's like, oh, we have 28 hours of battery life, and you and I both know no phone can play 28 hours of Ingress. We wish for the future. That's a wish. So from there, we divided the estimated number by 7.5 to replicate an hour of Ingress with background apps and phone brightness at give or take medium to high. Now in real world testing, I found that this number is pretty accurate, especially considering Ingress 2.0 will be based off the same framework as Pokemon Go, which has been shown to drain battery faster. With this method of metrics, it means that both a Galaxy S8 and an iPhone Plus each get just over 4 hours of active screen time, or just around that. And you know, most phones fall within the 3 to 4 hour range for playtime, which is what we see when we're playing Ingress in the field. Now for phones that weren't on the list, I would do a nearest neighbor or correlate data from another test. So nearest neighbor needed to be another phone with the same processor, screen type, and resolution, which is very important. Estimated time was adjusted based off of difference in the battery's milliamp hour. So if there's one that was 3000 and one that was 3100 with the same processor and RAM and all that stuff, we'd correlate the two. And screen resolution type is another very big one, especially screen type with OLED being different than LCD. Now I'd also look at how the previous generations of the phone, if they existed, handled battery life to see if the estimate seemed consistent, because sometimes phone companies are horrible with their background apps. So that was one thing I need to look at as well to make that estimated battery life. Now if the battery life data was correlated from another test on the same phone, like with FutureMark's PC Mark data, I would compare it to other phones that were in GSM Arena's test and then extrapolate the data from there to try to find the very nearest median on there and make sure, once again, we were very, very close, within 0.5 points, if possible. If the phone's battery was estimated, it was marked with a 0.001 on the hour. So that way we can easily see it in the data, and it can be corrected later if needed, if we get the correct battery life data from GSM Arena. And whether or not battery life was estimated or was actually tested was taken into account for recommendations as well. If two phones had the exact same score, or very, very nearly, the one that had the correct battery life data for sure would get the recommend. Now, battery life was also tiered. If a phone couldn't last at least an estimated 3 hours, it's pretty much junk for Ingress battery side. You know, there's very, very few phones that fit that description. Most of them were in the $100 to $200 range, where we don't expect much to begin with, but if you can't at least hit that, it's still a sad point. Now, phones under 3 hours were given 1.5 points for each hour. For phones over 3 hours, they received 2 points per hour of estimated playtime. And I think we all know that high battery life phones, which are a gem in the Ingress community, are important. So those are the ones that could get over 4 hours. Very few phones could get over that mark. So there was a bonus half a point for each hour over 4 hours. So if it was 3 hours of battery life, it would get 6 points. If it was 4 hours, it would get 8 points, plus that additional, if it was 5 hours, it would get 10 points, plus the additional half point for each of those hours over the 4 mark. Now the next metric we looked at was whether it has a removable battery. Some players like being able to have a few internal batteries pre-charged so that they can instantly swap between them and not have to worry about carrying a battery pack. But according to the survey, 84% of players were more concerned about battery life and charging speed. Because, I mean, now you could sit and charge for an hour, or you could take that hour and apply it as playtime points, which is exactly what we did. So 2 points were awarded if the phone had a user swappable battery. Now in this case, I did include the magnetic instant battery backs for the Moto Z series as user swappable. And the reason is that they are more expensive, but they held an advantage. They snap on and off instantly and don't require powering off your phone, unlike changing an internal battery. And also the way that they operate is a little bit different, so it actually gives you a little bit more battery life in some ways for the amount of time it takes to charge. So it had a quick full charge with 0 cables, and that was the requested reasons for user swappable batteries, and the Z's battery mods did fit those requirements. It didn't end up changing recommendations for anything except for one, and that was barely. So it really didn't affect much in the long run. Now the 6th input for the algorithm was charging speed of the phone. Since we drain batteries fast, with Ingress we want them to at least get to 50 or 80% battery life fast as well. Now Qualcomm's Quick Charge 3.0 is pretty much the standard on most phones today and provides up to 18 watts of charging. A lot of other manufacturers have something at least very close. So 1/18th of a point was awarded for the max charging spec on the phone. So if a phone's charging spec is up to 18 watts, it received 10 points. 10 watts only received a little more than half a point. And 29 watt phones like the iPhone 8 and 10 got about 1.6 points. Now it should be noted that max charging speed is usually only valid for the first 50% of the phone's charging, and it tiers down from there, but usually emergency charging, when the speed matters most, is just that. Emergency charging from just a few percent to a usable level. Now the last thing that we considered was whether the phone had any IP rating or ingress protection. Like literally that's what it means, ingress protection. Awesome, right? The resounding community consensus was that phones needed to be resistant to rain, but that fully submerging them for 30 minutes was the less important, since, scubagress still hasn't really taken off yet. So phones with an IP rating of 52 or 54, meaning that they were splash resistant against things like rain, got 3.5 points. And phones with an IP 67 or 68 rating, meaning they could be submerged underneath a meter of water or more for at least 30 minutes, got 4 points. That extra half a point is honestly, it's because you might drop your phone in a puddle, but usually even IP52 phones, the lowest splash resistant, can handle a few seconds in a puddle. So it wasn't worth a whole nother point to go up to the submerge me for scuba grass point. So from there, we took all of the points, added them up, and we looked at the current average selling price on carriers, Amazon, or other major retailers, basically how you can get the phone easily without warranty. And the number of points per $100 was calculated to easier compare phone's value for the money. So we can compare a phone that's $630 versus a phone that's $650 in price very easily. And that's how the recommendations were determined. Now for full disclosure, I do want to say there was a time when I worked for Motorola, but I have not received money or compensation from any phone company in over a year, and no one paid for any of these recommendations. But it's important to be honest and open so that everyone knows. But nothing influenced this. In addition, the algorithm was designed before all of the phone data was put in to make sure that the decisions were made by the algorithm and that the algorithm wasn't created with a bias in advance. There was some tweaks that were made to the algorithm, but they were only made, so I took my initial thoughts on the algorithm and they were changed off of weighted factors based off of a survey of over 100 Ingress agents worldwide from the official Ingress Google Plus page. Thank you guys for submitting your answers on there. We shaped it a little bit off of that. So we ended up, the things we ended up raising was the battery life became even more important in the weighting. So thank you guys for submitting that information. If you think that there's something that should be altered, check the video description for a follow-up survey or comment below to make sure that your voice is heard in how we consider future phone recommendations. In the meantime, if you haven't already checked out the latest episode of Best Phones for Ingress, give it a quick watch on our channel. And as always, subscribe to receive the latest data digging and recommendations on Ingress. It does subscribe you to the whole channel, so you may stumble across promo videos from my comedy tours that I do, but if you don't want to see those, only click on the videos labeled Ingression. Otherwise, get out there, have fun, use data, use your new phones, destroy, deploy, and enjoy.